Thank you for joining us this morning for our webinar on women's economic security. We really appreciate you joining us, and we really appreciate the really great lineup of speakers that we've got. I'd like to ask you to join me in acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're on, majority of us are on, Whadjuk Noongar Boodja. Pay our respects to elders past, present, emerging of not only Whadjuk Noongar land, but also all the lands, First Nations lands across the country. Acknowledging that this land was never ceded, that we have a lot of unfinished business in this country, which is why we as WACOS are so committed to a yes vote and the referendum for constitutional recognition and to establish the voice. We believe that this is an essential part of addressing that unfinished business and ensuring that First Nations people get to have a say over their own future. As a community sector, we have I know that the sector over here in Western Australia and in fact around the country has been committed to First Nations people's closing the gap and to the referendum and to a yes outcome. I also acknowledge that this is a tough time, particularly for First Nations peoples, and I'm very strongly looking forward to a yes vote and encouraging people to do that all that they can in the next couple of days before the vote on Saturday. I'd like to just quickly outline why we think this webinar is really important and why WACOS has women's economic security as one of our strategic priorities in our strategic plan for the next couple of years. I'm sure you're all aware that despite women now achieving high levels of education, we still continue to face barriers in workforce participation. We still have a highly gendered labour market and widespread undervaluing of feminised work. Women in WA are particularly hard hit and have the highest gender gap in the nation. The resulting inequality has, as we know, far-reaching outcomes, not only for the future of our young women growing into this world, but also for those older women who have faced entrenched disadvantage for years, and it further entrenches. Unless we address it, we will further entrench disadvantage for those young women entering the workforce and growing up today. In practice, we are seeing this inequality play out in many roles in the areas we work, in areas of family and domestic violence, and in for example, retiring into poverty. In today's webinar, we hope to untangle some of the issues and have a discussion around women's economic security and explore the role in particular, but also explore the role that community sector can play in addressing this issue and looking at improved economic outcomes for women. I'm really, really happy, and I think we're extremely lucky to have three really prominent women in this field, being Melinda, Cilento, Associate Professor Astghik, Mavisakalyan, sorry, I've practiced this so many times, Astghik, Mavisakalyan, sorry, I practiced it, I sincerely apologise, Astghik, and Professor Alison, Preston, joining us today to share their knowledge. And what we propose to do is hear from our three speakers, and then we'll go to a panel session where you can ask questions either in the chat or using the hand raise function. And my hand, just raising that, Zoom decided I wanted to ask a question. So if you have questions, save them for the end when we'll have time for a panel discussion. Each speaker will speak for around 10 minutes, and then we'll go to a panel session. First up, we have Melinda Cilento, who's a company director, economist, and experienced senior executive. She's currently the CEO of the Committee for Economic Development of Australia, CEDA, is a non-executive director of Australian Unity and co-chair of Reconciliation Australia. Melinda is also a member of the Parliamentary Budget Office panel of expert advisors. Over to you, Melinda.
Thanks so much, Rachel, and thanks for the invitation. When you read out my bio, I always think that people get to that last one and think, gosh, I wish I had her life. You know, no one wants to be more involved with the Parliamentary Budget Office. Rachel, thanks for your acknowledgement of country. Let me join you in that. I'm actually joining the call from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present here. We at CEDA are strong supporters of the voice to Parliament for a range of reasons, but putting my policy hat on, because we firmly believe that the voice will deliver better policy outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their communities in a sustainable way. And I fully support Rachel's comments around the voice and its importance, and encouraging people to continue to remain positive and push hard for this and do everything that we can to ensure a positive outcome on Saturday. In reflecting on what we've seen over recent weeks and the past month in particular, and thinking about our topic today around women's economic security, I think it would actually be really remiss of me not to sort of start our conversation by reflecting on some of that. And Rachel, if I could say, the way I'm seeing my role in this conversation is sort of setting the table a little bit. So I'll try to set the table and talk about some themes, and I'm sure the other speakers will pick up some of those, and things that have been left unaddressed we can come back to in Q&A. But in setting the table and in thinking about economic security and women's economic security, I think it's really important to think about empowerment and agency as being so critical, which is, of course, what we're looking for through a voice to Parliament. And I think the other thing to think about is that the tone of this conversation and reflecting on, you know, so for so many of my friends and colleagues who are women of colour who have been trying to promote the voice, the conversations have been terrible. And to think that in the space of what should be a civic conversation that people, and women in particular, are receiving threats of violence is just totally unacceptable. And it's something that I think we're all going to have to reflect on and lean into post the referendum. I think it's something as women we shouldn't take for granted either in the context of agency and driving improvements in economic security. And you can look around the country, and particularly into the US, and see that hard-won gains that have underpinned improvements in women's lives can be easily lost. And so I guess I'm sort of reflecting on a few threads that are going around at the moment and thinking, you know, let's be really careful to understand what the drivers of improved outcomes for women have been. Yes, what the challenges are, but you know, it's not. We've got to drive for future improvements, but also make sure we don't let things that we've achieved in the past slide, because I think it's an interesting environment that we're in at the moment, and particularly when you've got more geopolitical uncertainty and economic uncertainty, things that we take for granted might end up being a little bit more risky or not as secure as we thought they were. So sorry for rambling on there, but I do think it's really important to sort of that we all reflect on that. So as I said, I'm sort of laying the table, and let me sort of talk. I'm an economist by background. So I should also acknowledge this year's winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, ta-da, a woman, for her analysis on gender pay gap. Woohoo! She is the third woman to have received that prize, but the first to do it in her own right. So big call out to Claudia Gold and everything that she's done to advance better outcomes for women. Now, as an economist, I'm going to start by sort of talking about some of the drivers of economic security in the context of employment, which is so fundamental. There have been some positive developments that we've seen over the last sort of 3 or 4 decades, obviously, in terms of higher rates of female labour force participation. That's been much stronger than expected. And if you look at something like the intergenerational report, something that forecasters have sort of consistently gotten wrong, one of the things that they have not got their hands around is actually the growth in the labour force participation of older women, and we'll come back to that. But just to put that into perspective, the percentage of women who are aged 60 to 64 who are in the workforce now is over 50%, as compared with around 10% 40 years ago. So that is a massive structural shift that we've seen in terms of labour force participation and employment. Female labour force participation broadly has lifted by about 15 percentage points from below 45% to over 60% now. And we've seen a change in the profile of participation. So really in the last 10 or 15 years, you would see a much more pronounced drop in workforce participation for women in their child rearing, in the ages when they're having children. That's flattened out a lot. So again, there's some really important labour force dynamics that have been a really strong feature of what's been going on in Australia. Unemployment rates for women have fallen, are relatively low, and for almost every age bracket are lower than for men, except in that 35 to 44-year-old bracket. There have been some really important policy changes that have gone along with this shift in the increase of women in the workforce. We've seen a lot more pressure for paid parental leave, and we're seeing a high proportion of employers provide paid parental leave, as well as a government-sponsored scheme. And we're seeing more companies providing paid superannuation when people are on maternity leave and parental leave. It's interesting to note that the bulk of those employers who are doing that are providing superannuation on their paid leave, but not on the government paid chunk of it. So there is still a really important gap to call out there. So they're, positive developments. We've seen a reduction in the gender pay gap, although by no means where we need to be. And so increasing employment opportunities, and a reduction in pay disparity all help provide for greater income security relative to what it was. Women still face the triple whammy, as I call it, when you are in work and choose to have kids. You have the career interruptions, which can make it harder to progress to higher paid roles in your organisation. That obviously impacts your earning opportunities throughout your life. Often women come back to work in a part-time role. And then if you put the gender pay gap on top of that as well, you've kind of got this triple whammy of impacts in terms of your earning potential. And then, of course, superannuation paid on top of that is never going to accumulate in the way that it does for men. We've seen that for the first 5 years after women have their first child, there is a really marked reduction in their earnings, and their earnings are reduced by over 50%. And of course, men, once they've had children, that's not the experience for them. So kind of a bit of a mixed bag there. There's some really strong positive drivers of improved economic outcomes, if you like, for women. And there's a whole bunch of factors that have contributed to that. But I think there's some really important call-outs, and I think they're call-outs that relate particularly to the community and caring sector. So yes, women are working more and the employment rate is higher, but predominantly women are still in part-time employment, and the rate of part-time employment in Australia for women is higher than the OECD average by a considerable and noticeable margin. A lot of that work can be more insecure, which is also really important when you're thinking about periods of economic uncertainty. It also means that if you're a woman trying to get a home loan, for instance, it's harder to do, and it's harder to do when times are more uncertain and banks are tightening up on their lending requirements. We've already seen a massive growth in housing insecurity for women, with the rate of older women who are homeless increasing really dramatically. So all of those factors are things that we need to think really carefully about. And then I just wanted to talk quickly about the caring sector and the community sector. One of the really big drivers of the shift that we're seeing in employment and the creation of more employment opportunities for women is the fact that we're seeing the shift through our economy, reduction in manufacturing and utilities jobs, which are typically male-dominated, and really strong growth in the services sector, and particularly the caring sector, which is female-dominated. So that's underpinned some of the trends that I've spoken about. But we know that what we call is an Economist occupational gender segregation, which means more women in caring sector. That's been prevalent for a long time, but it's actually getting worse. It's increasing, which I think is really surprising and something that we really have to reflect on. And we can come back to that in the questions. We clearly need to increase wages in the sector. We clearly need to have a conversation about the role, the respect and the reputation and the way we think about caring jobs in our society. And that involves also more training and development and getting people to think about the skills and experience and professionalism of these roles in a way that they're not doing at the moment. I think there's really strong alignment on that in principle, but how we do that is really challenging. And one of the big things I want to call out is that for a sector that is predominantly funded by government, with governments facing into really tight budgets, how are we actually going to achieve that? And that's a really vexed question around prioritisation and compromises. It's an interesting question around who wants to pay higher taxes, and is that even a viable sort of conversation to be having at the moment? And if it's not that, then how are we going to increase the diversification of funding sources, which I have to say means more private provision? That then leads to a much longer term, bigger question around how do we ensure a proper safety net, which, by the way, is going to be really, really important for women as women live longer and with less economic security. So you can see like a nice sort of web of issues that we need to face into, and we can unpack. Finally, just to lay the last bit of the table, we've got these massive structural challenges and trends that are impacting our economy: climate change, the rise of technology and rapidly emerging technologies and skill needs. That's opportunity, but also it's a sector that is predominantly male dominated. So how are we going to think about that? And more broadly, how do we think about the investments that we need to make so that women's well-being expectancy is closely aligned with their life expectancy, and we don't have women who don't have financial resources and don't have access to services living in poverty, particularly for the last years of their lives. And I think I'm going to stop there. I've lost track of time, but hopefully I've stuck within my limit.
1 minute over. I think I'll allow that. I think that's okay. Thank you so much. You've well and truly set the table for us, and I suspect people are going to have lots of questions during the panel session. So thank you very much, Melinda. Okay, now I'd like to introduce Astghik Mavisakalyan. She's an associate professor at Bankwest Curtin Economic Centre at Curtin University. She is also the Curtin University Node Lead of the ARC for the Centre of Excellence for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Astghik's research has focused on employment, education, health, wellbeing, and preference formation, seeking to understand the role of the family, institutions, culture, and external shocks in these areas. Over to you, Astghik.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I'll just try to share my screen. Does that work?
Yes,
okay.
Definitely. Yep.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me as part of this webinar. I'd like to join Rachel and Melinda in acknowledging the Whadjuk Noongar people as the traditional owners of the land where most of us are based today, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I also would like to express my full support on Rachel's comments around the voice. Thank you very much, Melinda, also for the rich overview of the issues that are of relevance when we think about women's economic security. And against that background, I'm going to talk today about something rather specific, which is the societal shocks and their implications for gender equality, but women's economic security specifically. So what do we mean by societal shocks? These are events that affect large groups of the population. But in Australia, we've seen increasingly extreme weather events, natural disasters, bushfires. We've seen it going through the pandemic, cost of living crisis around the world. We observe many other types of shocks, such as conflicts. And a lot of my work over the past years has been focused on understanding the impact of these societal shocks, with focus on climate change related events as well as political conflicts, but also to understand some of the responses, or in fact lack of responses to these shocks, that would lead to more resilient societies. So we know that these shocks impact the lives of individuals in very important ways. However, these impacts are not distributed equally, and in particular women, but also other groups of the society defined by race, by the socioeconomic status. But in this specific case, I'd like to talk about women. Women are more vulnerable in many circumstances to most of these shocks, and often less adaptable to these shocks as well, given the socioeconomic structures and the norms across the societies in which we live. On the other hand, I'd like to talk today a little bit about the literature that tells us that if we had more gender equal societies, we would be more resilient to these shocks. And I'll elaborate a little bit on this. And then at the end, I would like to put these pieces together to suggest that perhaps if we improve gender equality across societies, would set a virtuous circle in action. So that's really what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so what do we know about the gendered impacts of shocks? So I'm covering a lot of literature in this space, and at the end, I'll offer a reference that which summarizes most of this literature. So we know that most of these shocks affect women's economic vulnerability in many significant ways. And this is largely reflecting the pre-existing inequalities in access to resources. And Melinda told us about many ways in which this manifests itself through gender wage gaps, through women's access also to sort of employment that is undervalued in the society. We know that women are overrepresented, especially at certain ages, very old and very young, and sort of later stages of women's life. They're overrepresented among the poor people. We know that women are also overrepresented in jobs that are precarious or part-time. These are all important when we think about the shocks and how then these circumstances then lead to further vulnerability among women. Recent work on Australia looking at weather events and natural disasters also shows rather vividly that disasters such as bushfires in particular lead to reduced employment and incomes for women. But on the other hand, in some circumstances, they may actually increase employment and incomes for men. And this is largely due to the gender segregation in the workforce that Melinda was reflecting on just now, with men, overrepresented in sectors which then, sort of become more important, such as construction in, for example, in a context of a post-disaster economy. There are other things to think about when we think about this issue of shocks and their impact on women. Shocks in general have the power of revitalizing the traditional norms. And we know, for example, from a data set like the World Values Survey, that large share of the population around the world and in Australia also believe that if the jobs are scarce, men should get the priority. And also, for example, that for a well-functioning family, that it is the man who should be the breadwinner. And also, the norms that give the sort of the priority to women as caregivers. And the shocks just further nurture the prevalence of these norms, which in turn again fit into economic outcomes and the labor market outcomes of women. And finally, we know the painful experience also most recently through COVID, that the shocks also affect women's well-being in many significant ways. They give rise to gender-based violence by partners as well as strangers, and this happens due to increased financial pressures, increased psychological pressures, substance abuse, and so forth. And also, based on existing evidence, we know that while both genders, everyone basically is affected by the shocks, women appear to have to be at a higher risk of stress disorders. So overall, what this means is that societal shocks may affect women's well-being in disproportionate ways, and which in turn may affect the productivity and through that women's economic vulnerability. Now, I'd like to quickly then talk about the observations on gender differences in behaviors around the shock situations. When I do that, I'd like to emphasize that all of this is in the context of socioeconomic structures and gender-biased norms. The differences that we may observe, but some of the differences that that some observers have pointed at is the differences that may ultimately lead to preferences and behaviors that would be conducive to mitigating the impact of the shocks. So in the case of environmental preferences and behaviors, and this is the space that I've looked at over the past years, what we observe in the data is that women on average show greater awareness and concern about climate, but also when we look at their behaviors around recycling and purchasing environmentally consuming in environmentally responsible ways, engaging in climate-related activism, we see some of these behaviors on average more prevalent among women. And people who have thought about this and the reasons why this may exist in the context of current socioeconomic structures and norms in which we live have pointed, for example, towards the differences in labor and caring roles. Some of the things that I mentioned before are relevant here. For example, people have pointed out that production of shocks, is often linked to activities where men are overrepresented. For example, here we can think here as the mining sector or the financial sector in the context of financial market-related shocks. On the other hand, the consequences of the shocks are often borne by women, again, given the gender segregation and the roles, especially in the caring sector, performed by women. I mentioned before that women are also more affected by shocks, which may also explain then the preferences for activities that are, mitigating, that may ultimately mitigate the shocks. And the socialization theories also come up with different ideas as to why we may observe some differences. But again, to emphasize that these differences, if we observe them, are linked to the socioeconomic structures and gender norms rather than, being sort of, more fundamental in nature. Okay, so what this then means? Could it mean that if we had more women represented in leadership roles, in decision-making roles, we would then see more sort of decisions made that would help with being resilient to these shocks? And the existing evidence seems to suggest that there is something to that. Again, I'm going to draw here on the context of environmentally sort of induced shocks. And what the literature tells us is that within the household, if we where we observe women having more decision-making power, we see these households also adopting more environmentally friendly practices. And in the case of farm households, we see more climate-smart agricultural technologies being adopted. At organizational level, we also see a lot of impact associated with women's representation on company boards. We've seen also we've done a lot of research at BCC around WGEA data, and we've seen that women's representation on company boards is beneficial for a lot of reasons. As it comes to gender equality. But in the case of environmental outcomes and environmental corporate social responsibility, we also see some beneficial outcomes linked with women's representation on company boards. And finally, some of my work over the past years has looked at women's representation in government. And in a recent paper, what we've done is to look at women's representation in the parliament. And this is a cross-country study. And what we've shown is that the increase in this representation is associated with more stringent environmental policy adoption across countries. And in those countries, we also see lower CO2 emissions. And some other work also in this space, which shows that, for example, in councils where women are more represented, we see higher recycling rates. So there is this sort of evidence put forward in the literature, which suggests that if we have more gender equality in representation, we may see practices that lead the communities more resilient to shocks. Okay, so if we put these pieces then together, there are two main implications that emerge. One is that if we continued to our efforts toward gender equality, we may see more resilient societies in the context of shocks, which then in turn may mean less gender equality, given the fact that women are more affected by these shocks. On the other hand, the policy settings which improve our abilities to respond to these shocks, or in fact mitigate or eliminate the occurrence of some of these shocks, may see more gender equal societies coming, emerging. So that's really the sort of, in summary, the main point that I wanted to make here. I have a reference there that sort of summarizes the key things that I talked about here, and I'd like to now hand over to Rachel. Thank you.
Thanks, Astghik. That was amazing, and really important information, particularly for our sector, who are working in this space, and also working on shocks and understanding that gendered lens around shocks that we all are dealing with. Thank you very much. Again, I'm sure you've got lots of questions. Save them up for the panel session after we hear from Professor Alison Preston, who's a professor and head of the Department of Economics at University of Western Australia. She has a background in labour economics and industrial relations, and is a fellow of Women in Social and Economic Research, which is a joint centre with Curtin and UWA Research. It's a Curtin and UWA initiative, and a member of the Work Family Policy Roundtable. And her current research is concerned with financial literacy, superannuation policy, the economics of education, and occupational segregation. Over to you, Alison.
Okay, thanks very much, Rachel. And can I also just acknowledge that I am on Wajik Noongar land, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. And as with everybody else here, I do hope we're all voting yes this weekend. In fact, I've already voted, so there you go. I'm going to share my screen. Where's my screen here? Okay, am I sharing my screen? Sorry, is that, no, it didn't share, did it? Let me just do it again. Okay, can you see my slides now? Yes?
Yeah, we certainly can.
Yeah, thank you. My presentation that I've got here actually mirrors a lot of what Melinda said. You'd think, well, it might have been better if we had teamed up before, Melinda, to go through this. So I'm going to repeat what you said, but what I'm going to do is have a lot of the diagrams that go around it. So maybe it's a good dovetail. You've heard, Melinda, what we used to say in teaching, you don't just teach it once, you teach it, 3 times to get the point through. So effectively, that's what you're about to get here. So let me just start off by this is the shift in employment population ratios. It's much the same as talking about labour force participation, and it's the point that Melinda was making earlier on, that we've seen a massive change in the labour force in recent years. Can you see my cursor there as well? I've got 2 screens and I don't know which one.
Yes, we can.
So here is the M shape that Melinda was talking about in the back in 1990, where women were in the labour market, and then they would come out of the labour market because of children, and then they would be back into around their mid-late 40s, and then they rapidly fell out of the labour market. Now you can see in the 2019 period that the status for that M part's gone. So women are in the labour market, and over those child-rearing years, they stay attached to the labour market. And here is that big upshift in older women's participation as well, which has really been a large part driving the female growth in female participation over recent years. You can see that the male profile's not really changed that much, and a bit more older men coming in, but the big shift has been within the female labour force. So with that, having looked at that and seen those big shifts there, and thinkable, because even although we've had this huge change in females' labour force participation, we're not seeing how females participate over their life course changing that much. So most women who are in the labour market, well, not most, but you can see this is a share of women who are employed full time, and you can see that, you know, full time employment's as a share of total employment for women is large over the early years, and then it drops off to part-time employment around those childbearing years, and on average women then stay part-time employed through the remainder of the rest of their career. So you can see that in older women, this, remember, is looking at the full-time, so the difference, we've got around 30% of women in older ages are employed full-time, which obviously means that the balance 70% are employed part-time. So part-time is a huge part of women's employment story. Again, a point that was made by Melinda. Melinda was mentioned that female unemployment rates tend to be lower than males, and that is absolutely true. What this diagram is showing is the underutilization rate. The underutilization rate is a measure of the unemployment rate plus those who are underemployed, who are working but would like to work more hours. And so what we see here is that women on average have a higher rate of underutilization because they're working part-time, but many would actually like to work more hours than they're currently working. And so if we were to look at the underutilization rate at the moment in Australia, we can see that for women it's around 12%, but the interesting part, a large underutilization rate for young people as well. And this is just a travesty in the sense of their skills and how we're bringing them into the labour market in a context where we've got skill shortage. And it will go into later when I talk about the education sector as well. This diagram here is just showing the growth of people in the civilian population who have a bachelor's degree or higher. So I'm just going to track the female one, which is this dotted line here. So back in 1980s, the early 1980s, around 5% of the civilian population, female civilian population, had a bachelor's degree. And if I fast forward to now, we're close on 40%. So somewhere between, let's just say for argument's sake, that's 38%. So an enormous uplift in males and females with a degree, but you could share of female participation in higher education, and therefore in coming out with tertiary qualifications, and now in the labour market with tertiary qualifications, has actually increased at a faster rate. And I'll come back to that later as well, because the point I want to come back to is on HECS as an issue for men and women, but particularly women. This diagram here is going back to, again, the point that's been made by the previous two speakers, is about the change in the employment shares over the last 20 years. So the labour market's changed enormously. It's been partly because of supply, but a big part of it is because of demand. We've got population ageing. As that population's aged, there's been a big increase in the demand for healthcare and social assistance. A lot of the people in your community sector, Rachel. So you can see here that there's been a decline in the share of manufacturing in terms of its contribution to total employment growth. But basically a quarter of all the employment growth in the last 20 years has come from the healthcare and social assistance sector. And because that's traditionally been a female-dominated sector, and because it's been a strong growth, then we have, as Melinda pointed out, even more occupational segregation than we previously had. This diagram here shows the distribution of male and female employment. This is back at August 2020. It won't have shifted that much, but you can see here that a big share of women, nearly a quarter of all women in employment, are in the healthcare and social assistance sector, followed by the education and training sector, and then we know retail trade as well, whereas the male dominate, and the distribution of employment is a large part of that is in the construction sector. And again, a point that Astghik was making as well, you know, when we have the shocks, be it the COVID shock or the fires or environmental, when there is these shocks, a lot of the shovel ready, and even the word itself says that when the shovel ready projects come on and the governments are pushing money into the labour market to help generate employment, it goes into construction, male dominated jobs as well. So segregation is a really important And again, to just acknowledge the fantastic work that Claudia Golden, and I've got one of her references here, Golden here, has done in terms of the exposing and trying to understand why is it that women have such a large disparity when compared to men in the gender pay gap, but also just economic insecurity generally. And perhaps just as an aside comment to make there, yesterday we were all celebrating her being awarded the Nobel Prize. I sent a link out to my colleagues in the economics department, and a few of the women got back and they were actually really distressed because of the comments that had been, the trolls, the social comment, the media comments under Claudia's award. I actually hadn't read them myself, and I've now decided I'm not going to read them because I can only imagine what they say. So it's that part of, again, agency and fights. You know, here we have a fantastic award going out, but I can only imagine how it is being undermined again. Anyway, to come back to this presentation here, so gender segregation, as you've got here, can take a lot of forms. The public sector, for example, is dominated by women. From memory, I think it's something like 65%. I can't remember exactly. 65% of all public sector employees are female. It's going to matter, and I'll show shortly, for things like the gender pay gap. But women, again, tend to be in part-time employment. Part-time employment tends to be of the temporary, casual nature. Women tend to be in smaller firms, and that matters as well. So Claudia's work and with others shows that part of the reason why it's so hard to keep on tackling this issue of the gender pay gap is because the labour market keeps morphing. Barbara Pocock, Senator Barbara Pocock, has described the gender pay gap as a morphing beast, and I think that's probably about the best way to describe it. So this distribution segregation really it does affect. So this diagram here is taken from Australian data, and it basically shows the gender wage gap just at the mean. It's just a high level statistic by establishments and the characteristic of the establishment. And let's just look at the dark blue lines, which is 2019. Gender gap in establishments that are mostly male is actually relatively small. You know, so women in those establishments are not, you know, to the extent that they're being paid a different wage to men, it's not that much lower than men. But if I go to the other end, and I suspect it's a lot of the establishments that the people who are participants in this webinar are in, they'll be working in establishments that are mostly women. And here, what do we see? That the gender pay gap in establishments that are mostly women is actually large. So the men in those establishments tend to be able to get up the ladder at a faster rate than women. This diagram here, which is a bit noisy at first to look at, so apologies for that, but it's just showing what's been happening to wage growth back from the 2000s. This is across Australia. So the red dotted line is the average weekly ordinary time earnings for women, and the blue one is for males. And so you can see that they've been growing at basically a similar rate, slightly faster for males. But if I look down here to this grey line, this is the minimum wage. And again, a lot of the workers in the community sector are on the minimum wage. And so the minimum wage, and I don't have the 23 data in there, and I'm sorry about that, because the last decision was, well, I mean, it was I think from memory, 5.75% increase. So that would have contributed to a little bit, a tiny bit, but you can see that the minimum wage really hasn't been keeping up with the growth in average weekly ordinary time earnings. And so part of I think the narrative here, and maybe something to bring to your attention, is the Fair Work Commission's decision to give from memory, I should have known the statistics, so sorry for forgetting it, 5.75 from memory wage increase, has had a lot of bad press, and it's led to you know, claims that this has been leading to the growth in inflation and a growth in wage inflation. And my argument is absolutely has not, and that's an absolute nonsense. We are talking about a 5.75% wage increase off a really low base, and so perhaps, you know, work with the Fair Work Commission to maybe even take it away from a conversation about a pay rise and to actually talk in flat dollar amount dollar amounts, we would actually understand how small that pay adjustment is. But anyway, it was a good decision that they made. It was an important decision that they made, but it's not going to have had much effect in terms of closing that pay gap. But nevertheless, it's a start. This chart here was just now showing the wage growth, but disaggregated by age, because I think age is a really important part of this story as well. And I really have a particular concern for what's happening to younger women. And not to say that older women are doing okay, they're kind of lost a little bit in the statistics, but younger women are not certainly, well, younger people in general are not keeping up, but younger women are also losing out compared to younger men. So this diagram here shows that before the GFC, you know, the wages were growing roughly the same rate, but after the global financial crisis, wage growth slowed for everybody, but it particularly slowed for young people, and it especially slowed down for young women. And hold on to that, because it matters when we come back to talk about returns to education, given that more women are now qualified and have been to university and have got HECS debts. This diagram here is showing the gender wage gap for full-time workers. It's just a raw average statistic, but it's nevertheless a good high level men or women are performing in the labour market. So the blue line is for Australia, and it shows that right now the gender wage gap nationally is somewhere around 13%. The red line is for Western Australia. And so what you can see here is in the early 80s, you know, we were traveling about the same. There started to be a widening. And then in the early 1990s, there was this huge divergence for Western Australia compared to Australia. And that was driven by a shift towards towards individual bargaining in Western Australia. So the nature of our bargaining system really matters. And when Western Australia went down a more individualistic bargaining system, we saw our gender wage gap really deteriorate. And we haven't actually managed to ever recover back to that period. This period here, where again, the gap was worsening in Western Australia compared to nationally, is really about the mining boom. But it's not the only story. So you can see after the mining bills tailed off, the gender wage gap has been improving in Western Australia, but down at nationally, it's really been starting to, you know, narrow again, whereas we've remained flat. And part of the reason that we've remained flat in Western Australia is because we've had state government policies that have decided to freeze the wages. And that has an implication because a large share of women are employed in the public sector. Oops, and this here is a diagram showing.
Alison, about 1 minute.
Okay, thanks. Well, let me just jump on forward and I'll go through, because I really want to talk about the HECS stuff here. This one, I kind of messed up. Now you've thrown me. Sorry, Rachel. This is about postgraduate enrollments. And so again, we can see that there's a big shift towards people going into a postgraduate, you know, to do postgraduate degrees. Teachers require it now. If you're going to become a teacher, you've got to have a master's degree. And that's all very fine. But what we're not seeing is the returns to that postgraduate education. So a huge cost goes in, not only the opportunity cost and time, but the cost of the course. But women, and this is that red line here, are not getting that returns. And again, partly because of their shift towards part-time education, part-time work, but they're just not getting the returns to postgraduate education. A cohort analysis shows that it's got even worse since the GFC, but if I jump forward, this is the HECS picture that I wanted to share with you. Here is the HECS debt for females. Before it was indexed at 7%, it was stood at 74 billion. Now it's more than $100 billion of outstanding HECS debt. 60% of that debt is held by young women. I think I've just got two more slides. One more slide, Rachel. This one here is looking at gender role attitudes, because the gender role attitudes, which Astghik was talking about, is a big part of this story. And you can see here, this is in 2019, that on the whole, men have got more traditional attitudes than women. But this point here, as long as the care is good, it's fine for children under 3 years to be placed in childcare all day for 5 days a week. It's a scale out of 7. Men think it's less okay than women, but a lot of women also don't agree with that statement either. And this is also part of that cultural move that means that a lot of women will continue to look after the children and work on a part-time basis. So let me just finish up by I don't need to summarize those points again. There's a lot of policy interventions about how we structure jobs, but I think also how we address the culture. And another one that I don't have in there is the education system and the fact that degrees, studies like economics and high schools are increasingly only being done in the private schools and increasingly just by males. So I'll finish there. Sorry for going over, Rachel. Thanks.
Thank you, Alison. That was really useful information, and I think all of our speakers complemented each other in the information they were providing, and as you can see, are posing lots of challenges. Thank you to all our speakers for your presentations. What I'd like to do now is to go into a panel discussion. And if you want to ask a question, either put it in chat or use your raise your hand function. I'll kick things off by posing to the panel, what do you see as the role of the community sector in supporting women's economic security and increasing women's participation? Where do you see the community sector's role in that? So just a small question.
I'm going to bat it off to Melinda.
Well, I think the sector is going to be at the forefront of a lot of the big challenges we've got in the labour force, and in the economy more broadly, right? So if it's community sector, if it's care, aged care, like this issue about how we lift product. I'm going to segue this into productivity too, Rachel, like how we lift productivity and how we think about participation and contribution. Like the services sector and the community sector in particular are right at the forefront of this. And so I think the sector is going to have to be really bold in talking about issues around quality, how you think about the quality of care, how you think about the quality of care and service provision in the context of community and societal expectations, which are really shifting. And, we saw my chief economist, Cass Winslow, will say repeatedly, we saw all this outrage around the aged care sector when the Royal Commission was on, but where has that gone now, and what's happening there? So we've, unfortunately, I think the sector is going to have to sort of maintain the rage a little bit around, what it means to provide quality services, what people's expectations are and how that's being felt by workers, the continued push for professionalisation. I put that in inverted commas, but just trying to increase the awareness and appreciation of the skills and experience that it takes to deliver these services well, and to really challenge society around whether they are prepared to invest and fund that in a way which is consistent with the broader standard of living that we have as a nation, and to think about that both in the context of a safety net, but also choice for those who want more choice, and how we're going to pay for that, and what sort of different funding models are we going to look for. And it's going to have to be, I think the sector is going to have to sort of lead the charge on that and look for other stakeholders who are going to support them in that, but think about quality of work. And to be honest, we talked about gender segregation. If you look at the care sector, notwithstanding the fact that it's highly feminised, you still see more males at the top of the tree in the sector. And we have got to debunk that, and we've got to think about different ways of working, how we can use technology to work differently, and how we can deliver quality outcomes without going down the traditional path of everyone just working harder and the big roles just getting bigger.
Yeah, Rachel, if I could maybe just come on the back of the few points that Melinda was making there as well. When Melinda was giving her presentation, I think we would all agree that this funding issue is really going to have to be addressed. We know that the government's got a massive budget deficit right now. We know that the bond yields are up, and that the debt service is going to go up as well. So they're going to be so financially constrained. We know that wages growth is not really going, and we're going to have this debate or not about tax cuts, and they're going to give the tax cuts to the wrong people, and the young folk are suffering there. But anyway, it comes back to that bigger picture of how is it that we're going to finance all of this. All of this. And I know that the white paper is talking about, job security and sustained wage growth, but it doesn't really say what we mean by sustained wage growth. It's not just about sustained wage growth. It's actually of the people in the sector that you've got. And then coming back down to, if we look at what's been happening in the childcare sector, and we know that there's the reports just come out there as well, but there's a lot of the private equity companies have gone into childcare and they're going into aged care as well. Why do private equity go into those areas? They go in because there's money to be made and rents to be made. So not that I have a solution to any of this stuff, but I think there's a lot of work that from an advocacy point of view, which I'm sure is very much on your agenda, and maybe it'd be interesting to hear what your view is anyway. I think that for me, in my mind, is the biggest challenge to then sorting out a lot of the other issues that we've just been discussing this morning.
Rachel, can I just add one thing too about the funding?
Yep.
People who work in the sector understand where, this is a terrible term, but where the incentives are and how the funding structures incentivize particular models and the way people work and the way they deliver services and care. And we've seen for a long time the way funding is provided is input focused or output focused and not genuinely outcomes focused, and is structured in a way that doesn't enable organisations to think about innovation and innovation to improve care, and so or service delivery. And so I think one of the other things is going to have to be pushing back at the models of funding from government as well to actually enable greater flexibility and a greater focus on outcomes.
Thank you. Any other questions? I've got one from, they're starting to come up. Got one from Vanessa from Just for Success. Thanks, everyone. How do you see the latest employment white paper and the redefinition of full employment impacting on these issues?
I don't actually really see it impacting on these issues very much at all. I mean, one of the comments that I read from Roger Wilkins, I think it was from the Melbourne Institute, is that the paper has a lot of motherhood statements, although I don't want to use the word motherhood again in this context. But I would agree with them as well. I mean, I think, well, the paper's good that it's put out some of the issues in, and the broad issues. There's all the issues that we've been discussing here today, but I don't think it's really going to get down to the guts of what it is, of the structure of the economy and the structure of the sector that you work in. So I wouldn't hold too much on that white paper, personally.
Any other comments? Melinda or Astghik, do you have any comments on that?
Astghik, do you want to go or?
No, not beyond what Alison said. I share Alison's point on this. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I'm going to give them a tick for continuing to push for transparency on things like gender pay gap, and pushing for more focus on that and people having to be more honest about that. I think the more they can push for other things in the same vein around. It's not just, yes, in full employment, great, and that's fantastic aspiration, but how are they actually going to get there, and how are they going to do it in a way which actually is about work, a proper employee value proposition. So they should continue to push hard on superannuation, on paid parental leave, for instance. And I think, when you look at the data that Alison presented and then I sort of spoke to briefly, there is underutilization and underemployment, and it's prevalent particularly for older women. And so it's not, if you're serious about people who want work can get all of the work that they want, that there's a bigger challenge there that's going to have to go to skilling and a whole bunch of other stuff. So the devil's in the detail on that.
And I think my other concern with it is this idea as well of a skills passport. I just think this starts to become a bit of a distraction right now, but maybe I'm just being too cynical this morning.
I've got a question that touches on childcare from Bev Joel. What role does the high cost of childcare play? And despite the high cost, childcare workers are one of the lowest paid roles and almost entirely female. Who wants to Any
I don't mind.
comments?
I don't mind jumping in there right now. Part of it is anecdote. I just became a granny the last. In fact, I became a granny of 2 children, but it's not twins. My 2 boys have had babies quite close together, but they're nevertheless, their partners have been looking at childcare costs recently. They are, one of my sons is on, he works in the mining industry. He's on $100,000 a year, which is a good salary, but he doesn't feel as if he's a high income earner at all because of what his purchasing power capacity is. Looking at childcare costs recently and going back to work and the family tax benefit and everything else, and realized, gosh, they're probably just not going to be able to afford it. And so already I can see, in fact, his partner Caitlin is the one that's already thinking, well, she'll probably just go part-time, and all of those conversations there as well. So I do think childcare costs, and as much as we're just giving the subsidies out, we know that when you give out a subsidy, what happens is if the cost of childcare is going up as well. So subsidies are not the solution to this. Again, easy to criticize, much harder to come up with the solution. Because, again, is the solution to go back to the family daycare type centres that we used to have, certainly when my children were going into care, and where there was much more community run, and we, again, the private equity firms that are playing in that market. I've forgotten the name of the guy that's the CEO of Good Start, but he's on nearly $1 million a year, and you think, gosh, how can he be on about 950,000 a year? And we know what a childcare worker in the sector's paid. So the private sector is actually paying the lowest wages. There's definitely a correlation there.
Rachel, the only thing I'd say is like we are still remain a society that is set up for largely a single earner, a full-time single earner to pin their ears back and get a greedy job and earn lots of money. Like almost all of the incentives are there. That's what makes life. This is my life, right? And I was fortunate enough to have a husband who was the primary carer. But that's the model, and childcare and the cost of childcare is part of that. But there are other things in the system. And the other thing I have to say is I totally get the focus on early learning and early education and childcare. But one of the biggest challenges too is when you've got flexibility in childcare, but then you go into the school system, and the school system is not set up for this at all. That's actually where one of the pressure points is more, where the drop off by kids start at 9, they finish at 3:30, and how do you manage that? So I actually think there's a whole host of issues here that if you are really serious about both people in the relationship being able to work, how do we structure things and how do we think about the incentives?
What I would add to everything that was said is that there are major long-term impacts also about having institutional structures like this, because they just nurture the traditional gender roles that get passed on through the generations of mother being a caregiver and the father being the breadwinner. And that's something that just is likely to then be passed on through generations.
There's a question here from Chris Toomey for you, Astghik, about bushfire response. You mentioned bushfire response can increase men's work and decrease women's. At the same time, are women more likely to work or volunteer in community organisations providing emergency relief in recovery?
Thanks for that question, Chris. I think it's really about the size effect. What we see is, yes, there is a demand for certain jobs that are dominated by males, and you're right in saying that women often then take on especially volunteer work in providing relief and care post-disasters. But at the same time, also in some other sectors, we see, women, especially those where women have these precarious jobs, being impacted, and all of these effects come together, I guess, in leading to that sort of overall economy effects that I was talking about. And the income factor here is also important, where we see men's incomes rise, but women's incomes at the same time fall. And if we think that this brings us to the conversation on how in certain sectors the work that is done in certain sectors is so undervalued that altogether can lead to these effects that I was talking about.
Emma, instead of me reading out the questions, I'm wondering if people asking them would like to actually ask them. Emma, do you want to follow up your question about what is the finding? What I'm finding is that women who work full-time are unable to purchase their own property. Do you want to explore that one a little bit, instead of me doing all the talking? You're on mute, I think. No, we can't hear you. Sorry.
Rachel, I don't know, but I can certainly read the question if Emma's not able to speak to it. So I can
so much for my attempt to be inclusive. Sorry about that, Emma.
So I'm reading Emma's, so let me just read out in case other people can't see what I'm reading there. So what Emma said is, what I'm finding is that women who work full-time are unable to purchase their own property, but yet become unable to maintain stability with that. What DOH is, but there we go, for a period of time if they decide to study. They're living below the poverty line. How's this going to be addressed? I see many women not going to go over the threshold just to maintain housing for their children. So Rachel, you're nodding. Maybe you take this one as your first. Rather than facilitate this.
Emma, I presume you mean Department of Housing on that one. Yeah.
Okay. Look, I don't know that. It's not an area of I've got particular expertise in, so I'm sure there's others better equipped to answer this than me. But I think, just my issue at the moment is the young people, for sure, their costs, and also the HECS. And so, the HECS is just massive now. And because it's indexed at the current CPI, and there is no reason why we have the CPI adjustment on it. They could choose any index. It doesn't need to be CPI. So 7% is an enormous amount for the debt to be going up by. And there is this notion that HECS debt doesn't matter, but it absolutely matters when it comes to trying to get a house, for example, because it comes into the equation for how much you can actually borrow. So if I look at the question that's sitting underneath that in terms from Susie about some of the policy changes that we can look at, then one of them could be about what we're doing about this HECS debt, and that might also go back to some of the questions about affordability. Although we also know the affordability part is if we wipe the HECS is a way of trying to make housing more affordable, and this is far too simplistic, but all that does is pushes out the budget constraint and can push up prices a bit more as well. So maybe the elephant in all of this room as well is this whole intergenerational wealth and the huge inequality that's actually going to be that is happening already, and it's only going to get worse. And again, maybe I can just finish up by mapping that back into, we need to look at how we raise taxes differently, and perhaps it's time to bring back in an inheritance tax as well.
Emma, I presume what you were talking about is the threshold in terms of the income you're allowed to earn to be in Department of House, isn't it? Yep. So that's what we're finding is that, and I don't know if it's the same in other states, but here you're only allowed to earn a certain amount to when you're living in the Department of Housing house, and the threshold hasn't been increased that much, and it discourages people from earning over that limit, because particularly at the current tight housing market, you can't find anywhere else to live, and that applies both in the city and in the bush. That's where you're coming from, wasn't it, Emma? Yeah.
Rachel,
I now understand. I wasn't aware, but I can see that's been a massive issue. Sorry, Melinda.
No, that's fine. And I'm going to, maybe I'll jump in and kind of respond to the policy piece as well. Like, I think we do need to think about access to affordable childcare. There's no doubt about that. But, to the comments made earlier, it's about more than just subsidies and whatever else. And we're already seeing, these what they refer to as childcare deserts and flexibility. And when you look at, if you look at the US where women work different shifts and different types of jobs, thinking about how you provide care at different hours and things like that. And I know there's a whole bunch of societal sort of judgment about that, but that's the reality of, people doing shift work and all the rest. And I think we kind of got to get over that. The housing piece is really, really, really fundamental. And I just think there's going to, yes, there's massive commitments on build, but Are they achievable? Who knows? I think there's a broader question here about how we think about housing and access to, shelter, for want of a more glamorous term, and the system that we've built where there's massive transaction costs, and we don't really think about what is suitable housing for people at different stages in their lives. Like, we don't have enough mobility across that spectrum. You buy your first home, you move into your second big family home typically, and then you sit it in until you're too old, and then you sell it way too late, and everyone's so there's a whole massive conversation about that, which links straight back to the sector where the proportion of income of care workers and community service workers that goes to paying for housing is just way too big. So how we think about that, how we think about affordability, and how we think about the right incentives and government support, I think they're massive issues. And so they're sort of some of the policy issues I would put on the table, apart from also just actually lifting the unemployment benefits.
Astghik, did you have any comments you wanted to make there?
Not specifically there, but I'll also jump to the point around policy changes that I think are important in terms of, when thinking about women's economic security and gender equality more broadly. I think we need to think a lot more about the cultural bias and think about it in more systematic ways. One thing that we talk a lot about is the gender segregation in the workforce, but I think we talk about it much later than we should talk about it. I often think as an immigrant to Australia, coming from a post-communist country where no gender segregated schooling existed, I often reflect on the gender segregation in the school system. We know from research that for boys, it's unlikely to matter in substantial ways. In girls, it may matter, it may in some sense, and it may nurture some traits potentially that are beneficial in the labor market. But we need to take a much broader look at this and just wonder whether, if we start the segregation as early as school age, then could that potentially feed into later outcomes that we start then thinking about? And perhaps we think about this much later than we should. And more broadly, other initiatives that may potentially then impact the cultural norms that are important in explaining a lot of these things that we think about. And we talked about the childcare costs, and this is an institution that effectively again nurtures the gender biased structures that we see in the society, with women working less. So that's kind of my thinking. Institutions that have a feedback to the cultural norms that may then have an intergenerational impact for economic security, and rather than sort of thinking about contemporaneous reactive responses to this.
Hey, Rachel, can I jump in on one other comment that's in the chat box? It's Christina's comment about, if women become more empowered and more resilient, then what role for men? And I think this is really, really important. And I think we've got to be framing this as an and conversation, not an or conversation, and really trying to frame this as, not women becoming more empowered and men becoming, less empowered. And I understand that there's a lot of angst about this. It's been the same with gender targets in the workforce and gender targets on boards and things like that. But I actually just want to say, I think we really just need to have these conversations and to try to find the space to understand where the anxiety exists and what the concerns and fears are around this, and open that conversation up. And the final thing I want to say is that there's a responsibility for us too, all of us on this call, and women as well, to think about the way we talk about these things and the assumptions and biases that we might have as well. And when my husband was a stay-at-home dad around the schoolyard, the bias and against him was just really unbelievable. And I'll give you one example where one of the mums who happened to be involved with the police force actually did a police check on him before letting their daughter come to our house for a play date. Now, one, that's illegal, but that's just a really extreme example of the sort of stuff that sort of sits around different models. And I think we actually all have to own that. And I'm sure any woman who's worked full time has also had the same stuff thrown at her from other women who are making different choices. And so each one of us has a responsibility for the nature of this conversation and how we actually talk positively and optimistically about an and environment in the future.
Thank you for that point. Very, very well made. Can I go to Kit? Do you want to ask your question, or would you like us to?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can. Yep.
Yeah. So my question is around the intergenerational aspect of like poverty trauma, and that like we know here in Australia the impacts of intergenerational trauma, but often I don't hear like how poverty trauma is being addressed. But you know, those of us that are impacted by it, like the recovery from it. Yeah, curious if there's any work being done in that space.
I'm more across just the kind of intergenerational impacts through disadvantage and the challenges then around building opportunities for participation. I'm less across work that's being done on how it tracks directly to women's economic security and what the solutions are there apart from prevention.
Yeah, sorry, Kate, I'm in the same. I don't really have much to offer in that. I was actually hoping Astghik might have been able to jump in there in terms of, I don't know if you now I can see Astghik is thinking. I certainly can understand the tenor of your question, but I don't have any evidence or research that I can bring back to this conversation other than acknowledge it's an important point.
Yeah, the same here. I think it's a really important point, and but yeah, I don't really know about the evidence here, and I think, but I certainly appreciate the importance of generating evidence on this issue. Thank you for raising that.
I think I can see Chris Toomey typing something, so we might come back to that question. But Kristen says, thanks, Melinda, for addressing my question. As a mother of a boy, their biases are very alive. I just then wanted to go to, Chris has a question around both HECS and childcare are places where our education system reinforces both wealth and gender inequality. Universal free education makes sense as an investment in the well-being, prosperity, inclusiveness of the whole community. Any comments?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I totally agree with Chris on this one, and I think that having early childhood education, really, we should be having it it's not just about care, but it's also early childhood education, and we should be talking about it as being universal. Although it does then lead on to the point that Melinda was making about the school system, and then perhaps even in there it comes back down to how a lot of these jobs are structured, because we know again that the school system is a highly feminized place, and a lot of the jobs in there are temporary, that a lot of them are insecure. A lot of teachers just don't know from one year to the next if they're going to be getting another employment contract, where they're going to be working, how long they're going to be working for. So again, I think the government I'm thinking of Western Australia right now, but and it's anecdotes because my husband's a school teacher, but you know, the way that the teaching professions run is shocking for the teachers and the insecurities that they have as well. So yes, again, I feel as if all I can do is identify problems rather than come up with solutions.
Anybody else? Melinda or Astghik, do you have anything to add there? Want to make a comment? So apparently the BCEC report Behind the Lines did show that growing up in poverty has long-term scarring impacts on outcomes for young people after they've moved out, both in terms of earning and their psychological well-being. So there is some work in that space. Maybe we could put the reference in the chat, would be useful, I think.
And perhaps, so I don't recall the specifics around gender, but the fact that the women, especially at certain ages, are overrepresented among the poor would then suggest some gender angle into in these relationships.
Rachel, can I just go back to one of the other questions that was asked above about, the policy side? So one of the other areas that I do research on is on superannuation and financial literacy. I didn't talk about it so much today, but in terms of the policy changes, obviously improving superannuation is important, particularly during those early times when they're out of the workforce because of the compound interest effect. So, if women are loading in the super at the later stage in their career, they're not going to get the payoffs than they would have if they put the same amount at the early stage in their career. But irrespective of what we do to superannuation contributions, the majority of retirees into the future, in particular the women, are going to be dependent on the age pension. And so it's not a story about superannuation that's going to be alleviating the poverty of women in older age. It's a story about what we do with the age pension that's going to be alleviating their poverty. So I think from community, making sure that the age pension is maintained and it's adequate is an important part of, I think, your advocacy.
Thank you. Can I ask a question in terms of, there was a question around, and when we're talking about productivity in the care system and aged care system, led me to thinking about measuring what matters and measuring meaningful outcomes in the care services. What role do you see with the federal government's push for, measuring what matters and looking at well-being? How do you see that being helpful when we're addressing the gender gap and women's economic security? That's to all of you.
Well, so I'm a bit conflicted on this, right? So I'm all in favour of, the broadest, broad measures of prosperity and well-being and thinking holistically about how we think about progress and measure success, right? And, I appreciate and acknowledge the government's effort in developing a wellbeing framework. The challenge is going to come from the translation of that thinking and metrics to the nuts and bolts of implementation of funding agreements and how services are funded and the agreements that are reached, for instance, with federal government funding states and all the rest of it. And, there's a long history of those agreements being structured in a way which is about governance in inverted commas and process and being able to ensure that the money is being spent in the way that it was intended, etc. And far too little focus on enabling organisations to spend the money in the way that delivers the best outcomes for their clients and actually having a degree of transparency and flexibility and agency and accountability for that. And there's still too much of a mentality that says, I'm going to give you $100 to spend in this way, and I'm convinced that if you spend it in that way, that is the best outcome, irrespective of, there might be 4 characteristics for your people you're working with or your clients or customers, whatever, but we just need to actually enable a different approach to that, which is very focused on the people closest to the service delivery, being able to put their hand on their heart and saying they're delivering good care. And we got more data than ever. There's ways that you can increase openness and transparency around that. So I get on a bit of a soapbox about this, and then we have to look at proper evaluation afterwards and not, for money that's been spent and being genuinely accountable for those outcomes. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is I would really love to see, I love the wellbeing framework, great, fine. I'd love to see some courage around some serious commitments to some things that we know need addressing, and we don't need to find more data about them. So we know we have a problem with poverty. We know we have a problem with homelessness. And yes, I see there's effort there, but on poverty, Rachel, I'm going to get on my soapbox here. We've got a pretty darn good solution for that, which has been shown to deliver huge economic benefits. And we saw through COVID. So kind of just do some stuff.
I think you'd get a lot of support for that. Either Astghik or Alison, do you want to make any additional comments?
I can just make a small point while sharing everything that Melinda just said. The small point is that often these laws and policies, they are important in a direct sense, but they also have very important indirect benefits that are long-term in nature. And what I'm thinking here is the signaling value. And the signaling value of something like this is really important. What is then what should be a priority in a society? So I see that as an important, I don't know, side effect of something like that.
Yeah. Thank you. Alison?
There's more a question back to Melinda, and again, agreeing with everything that you're saying there, Melinda. Do you think that what's the role that accreditation is playing in some of these places? I don't know if you know the answer to this or not, but I mean, presumably accreditation is there to try and accredit organizations who are meeting their standards of delivery, and do we see organizations not get their accreditation? Oh, I can see Kit's got a hand up there. Not getting their accreditation. Can accreditation play a role basically in terms of pushing for the quality standards that we're looking for?
Yeah, I think the challenge with accreditation is minimum standards versus innovation and new ways of doing things and all the rest of it. So absolutely, accreditation has a really important role to play in my view, in ensuring that basic quality of services, or whatever the societal standards are around the quality of care and all the rest of it. But there are some ways in which, and I think I'm going to channel comment that Chris put in the chat box, that if you define accreditation around some metrics, you're sort of restricting what's able to be achieved. If you define it in terms of the number of people doing something for a number of minutes or a number of hours, that doesn't create an environment where someone can say, I can do that. I can actually provide Joan, with much better aged care or disability care or whatever, if I do it this way, and it might take me half the time, but actually her experience is 10 times better. And if you go back to where the NDIS is at, that idea of actually, being driven by the person who's receiving the care or the service, and then thinking about how you can do that, and that's the challenge in all this. And I'm being a little bit sort of bolshy on this, but I'm pushing because too often, for the sake of consistency and being able to put your hand on your heart and saying we've got certain standards, you can lose a lot. And the reality is we're going to have to push so hard on the frontier of doing things differently and being really focused on what really matters and how we give really good quality care and provide really good services, and think broadly about that, and encourage more people to think broadly about that. And if I go off on a slight tangent, we're moving towards a whole bunch of people living at home and aging at home for longer. Tick, great. But who's doing the thinking? And hopefully, people who are thinking about the quality of their customers' lives are going to start saying, well, hang on, if Melinda's sitting in her house, but the social infrastructure around her is so rubbish that she can never leave her house, my quality of life is terrible. It doesn't matter what they do for me. So where's the agency to sort of say, that's great, but who's investing in this, and how do we put pressure on that, and how do we think about doing things differently, and how can I change my model of care so that Melinda's getting what she needs?
I'm going to go to Kit while people, if anybody's got any more questions, please either raise your hand or put them in the chat. But I'll go to you, Kit.
Thank you. Yeah, when it was mentioned earlier about women being at higher risk of stress to do with the shocks, I was feeling into, again, the menstrual cycle is a stress-sensitive cycle, and humans, I mean, I'm aware of the LGBTQ community, that not all women who menstruate, but people who menstruate, we typically menstruate for like over 40 years of our life, and how, like, whether it be like menstruation, childbirth, or pregnancy, and also menopause, like those impacts, having an impact as well on how we show up in the world, that when we, how to say it, like when when, let's say, a lot of women were expected to compete with men, but women's bodies are different to men's. And yeah, like to do with that stress sensitive impacts of the menstrual cycle, but also how it impacts health on lots of different levels. And I'm aware of a lot of men as well with health impacts that similar to females. But when, again, the costs of like healthcare, when people are on a low income and can't afford like good healthcare. So I'm curious kind of what's being done in that space as well to do with factoring in like menstrual cycle health, menopausal health, pregnancy health, and again the impacts for women or people's bodies that can't just like take lots of medication and just go on with it.
Does anybody want to?
I mean, I can jump in and just say I am aware that there's research being done, particularly right now because we've got so many older women in the labour market on the menopause side, and pushing for, you know, more special leave to be set aside for menopausal related absences. But it's and that's great and it's laudable, and I hope it comes to pass. But it's also challenging as well because it just sets women again as being different from men. And as you say, I'm quite sure men have got those same challenges, but a number of men have got those same challenges, but well, same but different, obviously. The title, a label around it, because the label itself can be a scarring effect for women. You know, as an older woman, if you're as an older woman, then suddenly you get labeled as going through whatever. You know, we all have a range of different experiences in the menopause period. Some have it dreadful. Thankfully, I've not been in that camp, but nevertheless, it's assumed that because you're an older woman and you're going through this, then all these anecdotes that come to pass. You know, you can't hold a line of thought. You can't be doing this. You get tired more easily. Those are prejudices that get subscribed to all older women. Men don't have that the same battle they have to fight at the older stage. So it's on the agenda. It's just yet another fight that's happening. It's great that it is now on the agenda, but it's just one of many.
Astghik, you look like you wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how much I can add to what Alison just said. I think these are really important issues, but sort of the empirical work in this space is rather challenging. So, for example, I came by some qualitative work on menopause, which suggested that you know, because of the stigma surrounding this, we see women of certain age dropping out of the labor force, and often this is you know, supposedly because it also coincides with grandparenting responsibilities. However, it could be certain things that are happening around that circle in women's life that affect their productivity as well. And so that could be something that you know, we don't really measure as much just because there is a stigma in the reporting. But also in terms of the mental health, I also share Alison's point around, you know, care needs to be taken around some of these things, because men do also go through a lot of perhaps different types of challenges. And one thing about the mental health, again, is the acceptability of reporting this. And it seems to be the case that the traditional gender norms stigmatize many men of still, you know, adopting of the mental health challenges that they go through. So all these measurement issues around the stigma associated with reporting what women go through over their lifetime, around the processes that you mentioned, but also in terms of mental health, what we observe, whether or not there are these gender differences or there are gender differences in reporting. A lot more work needs to be done for us to be able to sort of conclusively reflect on these things. But certainly we know that these are important processes in women's life, Kit, as you mentioned, and that they have productivity implications in many cases, and that's something that we need to be aware of, and certainly some implications follow in terms of practices and policies.
Melinda, did you have anything to add there?
No, I mean, I think one of the things we're sort of leaning into, and you're seeing a bit more about this, is just how we think about work and workplace flexibility and how we think about employee wellbeing broadly. And I think there are, as has been the point that's been made, is that there are, issues that specifically affect women, but there's a host of other issues. And I think there's kind of an ongoing reflection on how we manage well-being across work and how we're thinking about that. At the far end of the spectrum, you're seeing, some organisations in particular sectors where they've got highly skilled workforces and can work remotely, taking a much more flexible approach to leave provisions and, to everything from, they don't have a specification around how much annual leave you can take. They don't have a specification around how much sick leave you can take. And they just expect the grown-ups in the room to manage that. And, there's a lot that's appealing about that when you work with that kind of workforce. And there's a lot that wouldn't work for yours, the community sector when, you can't have the same levels of flexibility. But I think it's a bit of an open question that sort of sits alongside how we're thinking about the ways of work and just, it's a bit, I've used this language and it's being used more often, but, one of the biggest challenges for female participation at higher levels up the, more senior roles is just the demands of those roles. And I can kind of loop it back to the question about, where do men sit in this equation? And there's got to be a point, I think, where we start having a conversation about the sustainability of those jobs as well, and just how we think about the impact of work on the rest of our lives and how much it's meant to take out of you, right? And so I do think that that's kind of what's lurking beneath some of these questions that's very illuminated for women, because they've got these choices that have to be made at a particular point in time, and that's what we've always seen. But I feel like they're sort of being unfolded a little bit more across all of society, and I kind of hope that they are.
Thank you. I wanted to go to this question that Susie posted a while ago, which is, should the age pension be higher for women than men, given the lifelong disadvantage most women experience re-earning super, etc.?
Of course, I'm going to say yes to that one, but I suspect the answer is going to be you'll never get that one through, but because it's there. But yes, of course, why not?
Well, my cheater's answer would be, wouldn't it be great if you got to a place where your safety net was determined by need, right? And that's the cute response, where you had, whether it's a pension or other supplements, and greater diversity of supplements that reflect the different challenges in life, including challenges that people who live longer and live in isolation and a whole bunch of other stuff. So that's the cheater's answer, but maybe that's the cynicism in me saying that I just think you're never going to have a conversation that says we're going to pay women differently because of the way employers have paid them for a lifetime.
Rachel, maybe if I could just jump in there. If Siobhan Austin, our colleague, was in this webinar right now, I know Siobhan's done quite a lot of work on the inter-household bargaining, that particularly older households, around their age pension and the superannuation. So I'm just trying to remember what Siobhan's arguments have been on this one, but I think from what her point that she's basically said, and this makes sense to me, is that because, on average, men have got more superannuation than women, because their course and had higher pay, etc., and the superannuation is viewed, and it's certainly viewed by government, as being a household resource. So it's there, the superannuation that's paid to the partner who's been earning the more is actually expected to be shared within a household. But Siobhan's research would suggest that that's not the case. So whoever has the superannuation sees it as their money, it's my money, so I'm the decision maker of my money, and that has led to quite a lot of poverty, even in households that have got high amounts of superannuation wealth. The women are not necessarily sharing in the gains of that either, and some of them are facing poverty consequences because they just don't have access to money. So again, part of that policy discussion is how do you share it within a household in older years as well, and not it just being a private household negotiation. And I guess that's part of the domestic violence that maybe Astghik can shed light on as well.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. I mean, I think coming back to the original question, gender is an important dimension of disadvantage, but there are, of course, other dimensions as well, and that's just, it should be the disadvantage that matters. But of course, thinking a little bit more in detail around gender-based disadvantage and its implications as it comes to support in older age matters a lot. I think that Siobhan Austin's research here is of relevance, and we know that especially increasing awareness around financial abuse and financial autonomy, and all of these things are really important when we think about policies in this space. We can't just assume that within the households, all of these things are shared. They aren't, and they matter a lot when we think about support.
Thank you. I'm just looking at a comment from Rihanna Greenway, who put a comment in the chat saying, I think there still needs to be a massive piece of work around women's safety in the mining and construction industry. Myself and other females I know walked away from high-paying jobs due to the way we've been treated on site.
We just completed a report actually on the mining industry, especially focusing around the issues of safety and workplace culture and so forth. It's actually, there's an exciting follow-on work happening on this, which should provide more insights. But what we did we had the task of somehow measuring what companies do on these issues, and we didn't have any data. It's hard to come up with data on this. So what we did is to analyze actually the content of the company reports, with text analysis, and try to come up with some measures of the priorities that companies place on issues of safety and workplace culture and so forth. And it wasn't a good picture based on these proxies. So our colleagues at the Future of Work Institute at Curtin have been doing some primary data collection on this, and we'll see what comes out of that research. But that is a really important consideration. We know that that's really important, and more broadly, actually, the research shows that the concerns of safety are important contributors to gender segregation in the workplace. And that's just, and mining sector is a specific example that we need to reflect on there.
Rachel, can I just jump in there too? And I think, I mean, the fascinating thing, if you have involvement in the sector, and I used to sit on a board in the resources sector, and the thing that I was just always really struck by is just how you have to run these safety campaigns consistently. It's actually really interesting. Like you just have to be on it nonstop. And even just something that just you think sounds so basic is telling people to make sure they put their safety goggles on. And when you sort of get a bit of a flavour for that, we need more work around for sure, I think. But it's also, the issue is just persistence. And so I'm not really surprised by the sort of feedback, because I was just really surprised by how much persistent effort you have to have, and you just have to keep running these campaigns on safety and all this sort of culture stuff. And it's the same on all cultural issues, but it's really incredible. Just, you've got to be on it all the time in order to make sure that the standards that you expect are being adhered to.
We've reached a time where I'm going to have to wrap us up. Could I ask all of you to please thank our speakers, Melinda, Astghik and Alison, for their amazing contributions, both their presentations, but also their engagement in the discussion we've just had. I think it's been really insightful and has shown some progress, but also some key policy areas that we need to work on as a sector, both within the sector, but also from an advocacy point of view. And Chris put a question in the chat, but I'm going to use it as a comment in terms of the extent to which addressing pay equity is dependent on government approaches to funding of public services, particularly as we've seen from the presentations that women are working in the health and community service sector, and that's highly dependent on government funding. And so there's some work we have to do there with government with this for funding for the sector, but there's also other policy areas that we need to be working on that impact on women's economic security, as we've discussed, in terms of, for example, housing, childcare, income support. There's a range of areas that we are working on, I know, but it reminds us that we need to keep working in that space and specifically tailor some of our advocacy around women's economic security. Thank you for coming to the webinar, for sharing the space, for sharing your thoughts. If you do, and I'm seeing there's lots of messages going up there saying thanks. If you do want to keep involved, this is, as I said at the beginning, this is one of WACOS's strategic priorities, women's economic security. If you want to remain engaged, please reach out. Emily, do you want to wave? I think you're back in the boardroom now. Wave. Emily Hull is one of our senior policy officers. She's working on health and gender issues. Email, she's easy to find. Email her on emily@wacos.org.au or reach out or email me. We're really keen to engage with the sector on this because, as it's been articulated today, we've got a lot of work to do. Making some progress, but yeah, there's still a lot to do. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Really appreciate it.